This is Ken Williams with BGA Insurance, and the purpose of this video or presentation is to expand your knowledge base, your conversations around IUL, to give you more to talk about than just caps, floors, tax-free income, etc. For those bigger cases with more sophisticated investors, you have to have a basic understanding of some of the alternative asset classes that your clients have to choose from. The foundation of almost all of those conversations is the market. It can be either qualified or non-qualified. Almost everyone assumes or characterizes the market as the S&P 500. We'll discuss some of the characteristics or assumptions around the market or a managed portfolio, including some of the conceptions or even misconceptions that are out there. Okay, let's dive in. Again, almost everyone assumes or characterizes the market as the S&P 500. Common feedback is the market has averaged over 10%. Why would anyone instead put their money into an IUL? The column here on the left shows S&P performance going back to 1990, a tremendous average return of 11.77%. Notice the CAGR percentage listed below of 10.22%. So what is CAGR? CAGR is compound annual growth rate. In other words, it's what someone actually earns on their money on an annual basis, compounded over time. Notice there's 155 basis points difference between these two numbers. This is hugely important when it comes to understanding investing, compound interest, etc. Even and maybe most especially managing client expectations. To emphasize this point, notice the column here on the right. I took the same $100,000 and assumed a linear compound annual growth rate of 10.22% every year. Notice the end value of both columns is the same. This is the rate of return the client actually earned on their money on an annual basis. So what does this mean to someone investing their money? You should not care what a portfolio has averaged, and instead care about what percentage you are actually earning on your money. With managed portfolios, what you actually earn on an annual basis is usually 150 to 200 basis points less than what the portfolio averages. Money managers, investment banks, mutual funds, ETFs claim or even brag about 10% average returns. However, it's likely you are actually earning closer to 8 to 8.5% on your money. This again is a very important distinction that no one talks about and most people don't understand or even realize. So let's get into average returns versus actual returns, linear returns, etc. This slide shows $100,000 earning an 8% linear return over 25 years. You can see the portfolio has grown to $684,000 by compounding at 8% every year. That's really good. So again, let's compare an average return to the before mentioned linear return. On the left-hand side, I made up a completely hypothetical average return over 25 years of 8%. Notice that on the right, on the same $100,000, how it would have performed over those 25 years, assuming the ups and downs of the market, averaging 8% over those 25 years. On the slide prior, after 25 years, you had $684,000 on an 8% linear basis. Here, with an average return of 8% over 25 years, your 100,000 has only grown to 570,000. That's a huge difference. Let's take it one step further. On this example, instead of assuming 8%, let's assume the money manager comes back and earns 7%. Again, it's just a 1% difference in portfolio performance. But notice the difference in long-term value. The difference is staggering. You would have nearly $234,000 less money after 25 years, a 34.22% reduction in value. Again, on just a 1% difference in assumed portfolio performance. Okay, here I have to make some assumptions and opinions, and I'm truly trying to be fair and reasonable in these assumptions. The next few slides, I dig into conversations as to what is actually the market. Everyone assumes or suggests the market is the S&P 500. When we compare IUL to alternative asset classes, everyone wants to compare IUL to the S&P. This is a huge flaw in our industry. The reason is, I don't care what the S&P has done. What I care about is what people are actually earning in their portfolios. If each of you who are watching this are open to being completely objective, pragmatic, etc., pull up your 401k statements, pull up your IRAs, pull up your SEPs, whether it's Schwab, American funds, it does not matter. Within there is performance data. 99.9% of you have not earned or done as well as the S&P has done over the last 10, 20, 30 years. You just have not. So my point of this slide is, let's look at what I think is a fair and reasonable allocation during one's contribution working years. In this, I completely made up a sample allocation of 50% in large caps, 20% in small caps, 15% international, 15% in bonds. If you did a weighted average of historical performance over the last 10 years, your blended average return would be 10.32%, which is absolutely fantastic. I think we'd all be very happy with these returns. The problem is, compare that over here to what the S&P did, which is 14.13%. And notice you're about 400 basis points below what has been suggested as the market. So that's just one example. Let's take it one step further. Now let's look at the same allocation, but closer to retirement. Here it's just basic rule of 100 stuff, where one is reallocating and taking some of the money from large and small caps and putting it more into bonds. With this allocation, my blended average return is 8.2%, 8.26% at retirement, which again, in my opinion, is tremendous. But again, notice you're about 600 basis points below what the S&P has earned over the same time frame. So why is this important? We as an industry are guilty of comparing IUL performance, which products that we work with have diversified index allocation options, to the S&P, which is not a real life fair comparison. We should be comparing IUL to what people are actually earning in their portfolios with fair and reasonable interest rate assumptions, both during the contribution years as well as the retirement distribution years. We should also consider fair and reasonable tax assumptions that those alternative assets provide. So what is deemed fair and reasonable? This is my opinion. I've been doing this a long time. I think it's fair and reasonable to assume 8 to 10% during the accumulation working years, 68% during retirement distribution years. Typical asset management fees are 1 to 1.25%. Tax assumptions, whether qualified or non-qualified, 25 to 40%. Again, fair and reasonable in my opinion. So let's look at a real life case on a high income earning 40-year-old. This client can invest $40,000 a year for 10 years. So in the spreadsheet, I built a sample portfolio, which you guys can see here. that through the first 20 years, I assumed an average rate of return of 9.9%. Let me scroll down. So for the first 20 years, 9.9%. And again, I believe this is fair and reasonable assumption. Some of you can disagree and we can chat offline. Then basic rule of 100, as he gets closer to and into retirement, starting in years 21 plus, I assume a 7.8% rate of return. So you can see all of the assumed volatility ups and downs over here. Again, I made up these numbers that I thought were fair and reasonable. You may disagree, and that is okay. All of that being said, $400,000 of cumulative contribution, and this client could take out $92,000 a year all the way until age 100. Typical management fees are 1.25%. I assumed 90 basis points. Again, I thought that was fair and reasonable. I did not assume any taxes or anything coming out of this money during the accumulation or distribution years. These are just flat numbers. So I did the same thing on my next slide, which you can see here, except I moved some of my interest rate assumptions around. So I'll scroll down. And this one I assumed 9.25% during the first 20 years. Again, in my opinion, fair and reasonable. Then at retirement, I assumed just over an 8% rate of return. Based off of this hypothetical made-up portfolio, that same $92,000 in income would cause the client to run out of money at age 92. So then I built a third spreadsheet. Same for $40,000 a year for 10 years. I assumed 6% a year during the contribution years and 5.5% over here at retirement. Obviously, you guys know what this account is. Under this account, at about a 5.7% average rate of return, the client would get $110,000 of tax-free retirement income all the way to age 100. The account or this asset has a diversified portfolio of allocations, indexes to choose from with varying historical performance and risk characteristics. You can see some historical performance information for account C here in the 8 to 10% range. And for our sample design, we assumed an average return closer to 5.7%. So well below historical averages. So the question is, why didn't we illustrate a higher rate of return? Our goal is to provide objective analysis with fair and reasonable assumptions. As we all know, the market conditions have been tremendous for the last 20 plus years. And these historical performance charts are also based off of current caps and participation rates. We have to prepare and consider that not only could the market not do as well over the next 20 years as it did over the last 20 years, we also have to address or consider that those current cap and par rates move around. And they could and probably will come down. Let's consider and prepare for that by providing more conservative interest assumptions up front as we aspire to hopefully underpromise and overdeliver. I thought 5.7% was fair and reasonable. And again, you can disagree, and that is okay. So of course, here are the number pages to that illustration. 40,000 a year for 10 years, 6% during the accumulation years, 5.5% at retirement. And you can see my distribution columns here carrying all the way past age 100. Okay, let's take it one step further and go back to that CAGR conversation. This on the left-hand side is the S&P with historical performance going back to the year 2000. Notice the S&P over that time averaged nearly 8%. On a $100,000 contribution would have grown to $403,000. The column on the right assumes the S&P performance, but with an IUL with an 11% cap and a 0% floor. Notice with these assumptions, my average return is only 6.8% compared to the nearly 8% with the S&P. More importantly, despite having 120 point lower average return, you can see over the same time frame with the IUL, you have more money. Notice the compound annual growth rate of the IUL, because of the floor, is actually higher than the compound annual growth rate of the managed portfolio. Again, this percentage reflects what one actually earns on their money. So the question is, Mr. and Mrs. Client, do you want a higher average rate of return or more money after 20 plus years? I don't know about you, but I will take the money. This slide, a lot of you have probably already seen before. This pretty much communicates the same message from the prior slide, but in a graph form showing the client how protecting from downside drastically affects long-term performance compared to the volatility of the market. The next slide is a brief summary, and I don't need to read this in detail, but in summary, managed account A, we assume 9.9% and 7.8%, and the client got $92,000 a year until age 100. If you assume 25 to 40% federal and state taxes, your after-tax income would range in the $55,000 to $70,000 range. Managed account B, assume 9.25% and 8%. In this hypothetical, if you remember, the client ran out of money at age 92. Option C, which of course is our IUL, we assume 6% and 5.5% at retirement, which generated $110,000 of tax-free income. Typical cumulative charges of a properly designed IUL are 65 to 90 basis points in comparison to the industry average of 1 to 1.25% of a professionally managed portfolio. Also, notice the death benefit assumptions, which I didn't even get into, which are above and beyond all of the tax-free income already received. So what is the conclusion of all of this? The conclusion is there's an asset class out there to complement one's asset mix for retirement, and that is IUL. I believe that all of the assumptions in this presentation were fair and reasonable, not egregious, not smoke and mirrors, fair and reasonable. I had no idea how any of these retirement assets are going to perform long term. I think there are compelling reasons for this $40,000 contribution for at least a portion of that to be in an IUL. If you believe any of my assumptions are unrealistic, unfair, misleading, I welcome that feedback and can and will adjust my models accordingly. At the end of the day, the purpose of this video is to bring value, stack content and ideas around ways to help you close your first, your next, or your biggest IUL case. I just ask that if any of this information you find of value and it helps you move forward on one of your next IUL cases, that you provide me and our firm the professional courtesy to underwrite that case on your behalf. I'll have more videos coming your way. And until then, thank you for your time.